Explaining that call was harder than he expected. On the other end of the line, the dispatcher sounded polite but confused. "So she's your coworker?" "Kind of," he said. "We mod a server together. She's a streamer. She might just be offline." "She never just goes offline," he replied, hearing how desperate it sounded. "We were playing last night and something weird happened, and now she's not answering anything, and she missed a stream. She takes that seriously." The dispatcher took the info down, promised to pass it along, and said something that people in online communities hear way too often. "We'll see if there's anything we can do." What they could do at that moment was limited. Without a family member requesting a welfare check, without local friends to corroborate concern, and with only an online friend's intuition, there wasn't much urgency applied. Hours passed. In the night shift Discord, theories flew. Maybe Kayla had finally taken a day off. Maybe her power was out. Maybe she'd fallen asleep. Maybe the weird noises on the mic had been nothing. A roommate they didn't know about, a neighbor. The next official action didn't come from online at all. At 7:43 p.m., a neighbor on her floor, who hadn't seen her leave the apartment all day and heard her phone ringing inside when someone called, finally decided something felt off. They reported a strange smell in the hallway and the fact that her usually active apartment had been eerily quiet. That, coupled with the earlier call, pushed local police to do a welfare check. Legally, in the U.S., officers can't just kick down a door because someone's late to work. But with combined concerns, an unreachable tenant, a neighbor's report, the landlord unable to contact her, they had enough to justify a check. When they entered her apartment, they found signs of a struggle. A lamp knocked over. A chair pushed back. A headset on the floor, one ear cup cracked. Her gaming chair askew. A half-empty energy drink on the desk, condensation dried into a ring. The door's chain was broken, hanging limply. What they didn't find was Kayla. Her phone was on the kitchen counter, battery at 3%. Her keys were missing. So were a canvas backpack, a hoodie, and a pair of sneakers. To officers, the initial picture was confusing. Was this a kidnapping? Had she left with someone? Had there been a fight and then a departure? The neighbor hadn't heard any screaming, just what they thought was loud music. Looking at the scene, one of the officers wrote in his report that it could be consistent with a domestic dispute or altercation between roommates. Trouble is, Kayla didn't have a roommate. By the time detectives were called in and the scene was taped off, the night shift server had turned into a real-time information hub. Someone claimed they'd seen screenshots on Twitter about a missing streamer. Someone else saw police activity tagged a few blocks from her address. When local news finally published a short online piece about a missing 23-year-old woman last seen at her apartment, Lex and the others didn't need a description. The photo was a familiar one, the same selfie she used as her Twitch avatar. For many true crime stories, this is where the narrative moves purely into the world of detectives, evidence bags, and press conferences. But in this case, while physical evidence was being logged and neighbors were being interviewed, something else was happening in a corner of the internet that the detectives initially didn't take seriously. Gamers were scrubbing through VODs. Mara remembered the weird audio from the night before and did what any mod who had spent years clipping funny moments would do. She downloaded the VOD of Kayla's last stream. She muted the game audio, boosted the desktop sound, slid the playback speed down, put on her headphones and listened over and over to the same 40-second window, the knock, the chain, the male voice. She posted a timestamp in Discord, 11 hours 42 minutes and 17 seconds. Listen. Then, like any group activated into mode detective, they started picking it apart frame by frame, second by second. Content reference, oocyte, 0, index equals 0. Online, our brains love puzzles. When something doesn't quite fit, an argument that cuts off too abruptly, a background noise that doesn't match the supposed story, it's like a hook. The night shift crew, already bonded over games that required strategy, pattern recognition, and cooperation, turned that same energy toward the clip. At 11 hours 42 minutes and 20 seconds in the VOD, just after she says, "Hold on, someone's at my door," you can hear the faint jingle of keys. Not hers. Hers are usually on the desk, visible in the facecam. At 11 hours 42 minutes and 25 seconds, you can clearly hear the chain sliding. Then a man's voice, low and kind of slurred. "We need to talk." The discourse exploded. Does anyone recognize that voice? Could it be her ex? Didn't she say her ex moved out of state? Then someone noticed something else. Right before the sound of the chain, A reflection flashes on the left edge of her webcam frame. It's tiny, distorted in the glass of a nearby picture frame, but on a high-resolution monitor, you can make out a dark hoodie and what looks like a rectangle of white on the left sleeve. A patch? A logo? One of the younger members of the server, a high schooler who spent his free time editing gameplay montages, downloaded the VOD, zoomed in, applied sharpening filters, and posted a still image. It wasn't crystal clear by any means, but to a mind hungry for patterns, it looked like a black hoodie with a white bar near the shoulder. Nothing distinctive enough to go straight to an arrest, but something. In another corner of the server, someone else was paying attention to the ambient sound. Among the overlapping noise, a faint sequence of tones stood out. 3 beeps, a short pause, then 2. It wasn't part of the game audio, and it didn't match any Discord notification. It sounded public, like something from outside the apartment. "Wait," someone wrote. "Is that the light rail crossing near downtown? It does that pattern." They pulled up a video from YouTube of someone vlogging near the light rail line in her city. Played the clip side by side. Bullet operator, bullet operator, bullet operator, beep, beep, beep. Pause, beep, beep. It matched. That meant whoever was at her door arrived at a time when a train was passing close enough for the sound to travel up to her apartment, implying a rough window of when they'd reached the building. It also meant that if there were security cameras anywhere nearby, there might be footage of them entering or leaving. What the gamers were doing, synchronizing audio, cross-referencing ambient noise, extracting details from a webcam reflection, isn't all that different from what digital forensic investigators do. The difference was that they were amateurs, operating on instinct and obsession, not training. By the following day, the night shift server had essentially split into 2 tracks. On one side, people were scared, grieving, posting art of Kayla, sharing clips of her laughing, expressing disbelief that this was real. She wasn't just a username. She was the friend who stayed in voice call an extra hour because you sounded sad, the person who'd send you a bit of money for food if she could. On the other side, a smaller group was grinding through data, VODs, chat logs, moderation history, old DMs. And just like in many investigations, their first steps were shaped by their own cognitive biases. The most obvious suspect on paper was Kayla's ex-boyfriend, Ryan. He'd appeared in a few older streams, and chat remembered them bickering. People had seen her tweet vague comments about a breakup that got messy. When something bad happens to a woman living alone, the ex is often assumed to be the culprit, and sometimes he is. But that assumption can become a kind of vice de confirmatio. You expect him to be the bad guy, so every piece of information is filtered through that lens. Content reference, oocyte, 1, index equals 1. Within hours, people were digging through old clips looking for anything Ryan had said that sounded controlling. A half-joking comment about "you're mine." A moment where he looked annoyed when chat flirted. A clip where he walked behind her on camera and said, "You should lock your door when you stream," which at the time sounded like teasing but now felt ominous. They shared their suspicions in the public channels. Some even tried to track down his social media, which is the point where online sleuthing veers dangerously close to harassment. To his credit, Lex stepped in and shut that down. He pinned a message in the main channel. "We are not doxing anyone. We are not harassing her ex. We are not detectives. If you have actual info, DM me or Mara. Do not post private info publicly. This is serious." Part of what made this case so unique is that Night Shift somehow walked a line that many online communities fail to walk during real-time investigations. They harnessed the modo detective energy but tried, as much as possible, to keep it ethical. No one here was trying to be a vigilante hero impressing the internet. They genuinely wanted to help solve what happened to their friend without ruining other lives in the process. Content reference, oocyte, 2, index equals 2. Meanwhile, in the offline world, detectives were doing the things you'd expect. They canvassed the building, pulled security footage from the lobby and the street, checked her phone records, reached out to her family, who lived several states away and had already been worrying about the lack of contact. Within 48 hours, their working theory was indeed centered on Ryan. They'd broken up a few months earlier. There had been arguments. Text messages existed where he'd apologized for losing his temper. He didn't live in the same state anymore, but he had visited the city within the last year. Domestic violence cases, sadly, often fit this pattern, and investigators see so many similar histories that it's easy to anchor on that narrative early. Content reference, oocyte, 3, index equals 3. They reached out to him, confirmed his current address, and requested an interview. To their surprise, he not only cooperated, but provided what appeared to be a solid alibi. He'd been working an overnight shift at a warehouse, with time-stamped logs and multiple co-workers who remembered seeing him there. Security footage backed him up. That didn't completely clear him. He could have asked someone else to go to her apartment, but it weakened the case. Investigators then turned to the next most obvious suspect, a stranger. Maybe it was a random break-in. Maybe a neighbor. Maybe someone she'd met offline. What they didn't focus on, initially, was the category that her Discord friends were screaming about, an online stalker who had crossed into the real world. Back in night shift, a different name kept coming up. Grimreap 3 or 47. The banned viewer turned problem stalker. Digging through the mod logs, Mara found that Grim, under various similar usernames, had been banned 7 separate times over 6 months, each time escalating in weirdness. He'd sent gifts to her P.O. box after she'd mentioned it once on stream. He'd DM'd other viewers asking if they knew where she lived. There was even a message where he claimed he'd seen her building from the street, and that it was easy to get in. Kayla had once joked in mod chat that he sounded like the type to be, in his 30s, living in his mom's basement, but no one actually knew who he was. The email addresses tied to his Twitch accounts were throwaways. The IP logs, which only the platform itself could see, weren't accessible to fans. However, there was one piece of information that Grim had left behind without realizing how valuable it could be. In one of the earlier bans months before, he'd joined the Night Shift Discord server. He didn't talk much, preferring to lurk in Kayla's stream, but he had to accept an invite to get in. When Mara searched for his known usernames in the member list, nothing popped up. He'd been banned there, too, after a creepy DM to another woman. But Discord keeps IDs and logs. Mara, who worked in customer support in her day job and had a stubborn streak, dug through old screenshots and found one where someone had tagged him in a channel conversation before he'd been removed. That was enough to track down his unique user ID, a long string of numbers that doesn't change even if you alter your visible username. She wrote it down on a sticky note. And then, because she'd watched enough crime documentaries to know that evidence loses value if it's not in the hands of authorities, she called the detective's number from the missing persons flyer. What followed was an awkward, slightly surreal conversation. "Hi, my name is Redacted. I'm one of Kayla's mods. I think I have information on someone who was harassing her repeatedly before she went missing." The detective was polite but skeptical. They're used to getting calls from people with vague feelings or YouTube theories. The idea that some middle-of-the-country mom who moderated a game chat had something useful sounded unlikely. "Ma'am, we appreciate your concern, but we're pursuing several active leads at this time." "This isn't a feeling," she insisted. "We have logs. Screenshots. There's a guy who was banned over and over for stalking behavior. I have his Discord ID. I have his messages where he admits to being near her building." That last part made him pause. Within a day, a detective actually sat down in front of a computer with Mara on a video call as she shared her screen and scrolled through the logs. To his credit, once he saw the volume of messages, his tone changed. This wasn't just a fan who'd gotten a little too attached. This was a pattern of fixation, entitlement, and boundary pushing that would raise red flags in any context. He asked her to email everything, screenshots, timestamps, the ID, to the department's digital forensics unit. That's where the worlds of gaming and law enforcement finally collided in a productive way. Using subpoenas, the department requested information from both Twitch and Discord tied to that user ID and associated accounts. That included IP addresses, login times, and in some cases, billing details if any purchases had been made. When those records came back, they painted a picture the night shift crew had only speculated about. Grim was not some anonymous, untraceable phantom. He was a 34-year-old man named Thomas Reed, living roughly 20 minutes from Kayla's apartment by car. He worked irregular hours, lived with his mother, had a minor record for trespassing and a restraining order from a previous girlfriend, stemming from behavior that, on paper, looked unsettlingly familiar. Repeated messages, showing up uninvited at her workplace, insisting that they were meant to be together. That restraining order, ironically, was one of the reasons he'd retreated so deeply into online life. In his mind, the internet was a place where he could be close to women without technically violating the order. But obsession doesn't respect formats, it just adapts. Investigators also noticed something else. On the night Kayla's stream went offline, Thomas's IP address logged a series of connections, first from his home Wi-Fi, accessing Twitch, then from a mobile device connected to a different network, roughly in the area of her apartment building, accessing the same accounts. When forensic analysts synced that timeline with the VOD timestamps and the light rail schedule, the puzzle pieces started to align. Someone had watched her stream from home, traveled into the city, arrived at her building at roughly the time a train passed outside, and then minutes later, her stream had cut out during a confrontation. Still, suspicion isn't proof. Cops can't arrest someone because a bunch of gamers think he sounds like the voice on a clip. They needed more. Once again, the digital trail helped. Security footage from the lobby of her building showed a man in a dark hoodie, with a patch on the left sleeve, entering behind another resident around 11:30 p.m. No forced entry, he'd simply slipped in as the door closed after them, a common and worrying security vulnerability in many apartment buildings. The footage wasn't high definition, but his gait, height, and build were roughly consistent with Thomas. Even more damning, the camera caught a partial license plate as he left about 45 minutes later, walking briskly back to a car parked down the block. The plate matched a vehicle registered to his mother. Weeks later, when Kayla's body was found in a wooded area off a hiking trail on the outskirts of the city, heavy rain had washed away a lot of trace evidence. There were no usable fingerprints on the backpack they recovered with her ID inside, but a partial footprint in the mud roughly matched the brand and size of the sneakers Thomas was known to wear, based on social media photos. The cause of death, according to the medical examiner, was blunt force trauma to the head. There were signs of a struggle. She had fought back. What there wasn't, however, was direct, smoking gun physical evidence. No clear DNA match, no murder weapon recovered, no confession. This is where the investigation might have stalled into a frustrating limbo, one of those cases where everyone knows who did it, but no one can quite prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. What changed that trajectory, oddly enough, wasn't fingerprints or a dropped piece of jewelry. It was a gamer's habit of never deleting anything. Remember that faint, partially visible hoodie patch caught in the reflection of her picture frame on the VOD? The one the teens in Night Shift had tried to enhance? As part of the digital evidence package, investigators had also requested Kayla's local recording files from her PC. She had been running OBS, a popular streaming software, in a way that not only sent video to Twitch's servers, but also saved a higher quality version locally. That local copy, unlike the compressed online VOD, had clearer resolution. Under the careful eye of digital forensics, the team enhanced that tiny reflection, not in the magical way movies show, but enough to distinguish a logo. A white bar with a stylized black R inside a circle. It was a logo for a local minor league baseball team, a team whose merch wasn't sold nationwide, but primarily in their region. When detectives searched Thomas's home under warrant, they found a black hoodie with that exact logo on the sleeve, stuffed in the back of his closet. It had been washed, but a trace forensic test still lifted a faint presence of Kayla's skin cells and hair on the fabric, consistent with them having been in close physical contact. Combined with his digital trail, his documented obsessive behavior, and the timeline, prosecutors believed they had enough for an arrest. The media quickly picked up the story, branding it some variation of gamers help catch alleged killer, a headline that made Night Shift uncomfortable. They didn't feel like heroes. They felt like friends who had done the bare minimum any friend should do, refused to look away. The arrest itself was tense but uneventful. Thomas was taken in without incident. He denied everything. In interviews, he claimed he'd never been to her apartment building. Said the hoodie must have been contaminated somehow. Suggested that anyone could have used his accounts or his car. He cast himself as a misunderstood fan who cared too much, not someone violent. During the trial, which started nearly a year after the murder, both sides battled over the meaning of digital evidence. The prosecution painted a picture of escalation, a parasocial devotion that turned possessive, then frightening, then deadly. They brought in Mara to testify about the barrage of messages. Lex testified about the night of the stream, describing the sounds they heard and the way her suddenly offline status had sent alarms ringing in their heads. They played clips of the VOD audio for the jury, asking them to focus on the tension in her voice. Digital forensics experts walked the jury through IP logs, showing how his accounts traveled with him that night. They explained the hoodie reflection, the light rail audio, the Discord ID trail from Grimm to Thomas. The defense pushed back hard. They argued that online spaces are noisy, that people exaggerate, that the messages, while cringeworthy, weren't evidence of a crime. They suggested that the gamers' collective analysis of the VOD had contaminated the investigation, that they'd seen patterns where there were none. They hammered home the lack of traditional forensic anchors: no weapon, no clear DNA, no eyewitnesses in the apartment. They attempted to introduce doubt about the hoodie testing. How can you be sure this wasn't transfer from some other interaction? You've said yourself that trace evidence can sometimes travel in unexpected ways. Most chillingly, they leaned into the stereotype of gamers as socially awkward, dramatic, prone to fantasy. They suggested that the night shift community had wanted so badly to be part of a story, to be the heroes of a real-life mystery, that they'd overreached. This is where the jury's own cognitive biases were on full display. Some jurors later admitted that they'd initially dismissed the idea of gamers solving a crime as something out of a Netflix show. It didn't fit their mental model of who does real investigative work. Content reference, OASITE, 4. Index equals 4. But the prosecution was smart. They didn't simply lean on the gamers as detectives. They framed them as witnesses and as a catalyst. The digital evidence they'd surfaced wasn't treated as proof in itself, but as a roadmap that had helped law enforcement find the more conventional forms of evidence. Without the Discord logs, maybe the IP subpoenas never happen. Without the audio, maybe nobody connects the light rail sound. Without the obsession documented in chat, Thomas might have remained just another name on a list of possible suspects. In American courts, the standard is beyond a reasonable doubt, not beyond any doubt. The question the jury had to answer wasn't whether there was a hypothetical alternate universe where some stranger, not Thomas, had broken into Kayla's apartment, worn his hoodie, used his accounts, and disposed of her body in a way that aligned perfectly with his digital shadow. The question was whether that scenario was reasonable. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict on charges of second-degree murder, kidnapping, and cyberstalking. In victim impact statements, Kayla's parents talked about how surreal it was to see their daughter's digital life, something they'd only half understood while she was alive, dissected under courtroom lights. How proud and heartbroken they were to hear strangers talk about her as a friend, a comfort, a voice in the night. Members of Night Shift filled a few rows in the gallery on sentencing day. Some had met in person for the first time just to be there. They wore subtle symbols from the server, a certain color scheme, a small pin, but mostly sat quietly, hands folded, listening. When the judge handed down a lengthy sentence, citing the predatory nature of the stalking and the vulnerability of someone whose work required public exposure, there was no cheer. Just a collective exhale. Justice, in a system that never brings anyone back, is a complicated word. In the months after the trial, the story of Kayla's case spread far beyond the Night Shift Discord. Articles were written about digital communities aiding investigations. Panels at gaming conventions discussed streamer safety, parasocial boundaries, and the reality that just online harassment is often a warning sign, not a contained phenomenon. Twitch updated some of its safety tools. Discord quietly expanded some of its reporting options. None of this happened solely because of this one case, but it was part of a pattern of growing recognition. Crimes that start in digital spaces are real crimes. Inside Night Shift, the vibe changed. They still played games, still posted memes, but there was a gravity there now. New rules were put in place for how to handle stalker behavior. Mods were trained to document and escalate threats, not just ban quietly and hope the problem would disappear. They set up a private channel where women on the server could share concerns without being talked over. Once a year, on the anniversary of Kayla's last stream, they set aside a night to queue up together in Legends of Eldoria, locking in the roles they used to play, and run matches while her favorite playlist loops in the background. In voice chat, they share stories: the time she accidentally queued into the wrong region, the night she gave an impromptu pep talk that pulled someone out of a depressive spiral. They built, out of shared grief and shared screens, a kind of memorial that makes sense for people whose friendships exist primarily in headset audio and text channels. So what do we do with a story like this? On Uma Kamada, it's a murder mystery with a modern twist, a crime half-witnessed through a webcam, pieced together through logs and clips and timestamps. It scratches that deep human itch we have for puzzles, for seeing patterns, for believing that if we just look closely enough, no crime is truly perfect. On another layer, it's a cautionary tale about the way we minimize threats that begin online. How many times have people said, It's just a troll. It's just a weirdo in chat. Just block him. We have a cultural tendency, especially among those who didn't grow up with the internet as a primary social space, to treat online harassment as less real than someone banging on your door. But as this case shows, that line is thinner than we like to admit. Someone who feels entitled to your time, your attention, your existence, doesn't stop feeling that entitlement when they close a browser. Parasocial obsession, left unchecked, can bleed into the physical world with tragic results. At the same time, there's a third layer here that's more hopeful. Because in a media landscape that often paints gamers as isolated, toxic, or disengaged from reality, this case is a reminder that online communities can also be incredible engines of care and action. A group of people who only knew each other by handles and avatars refused to accept "she's probably fine" as the final word. They documented. They advocated. They called. They pushed past the discomfort of being just an online friend and insisted that what they knew, what they'd seen and heard mattered. They weren't perfect. They made assumptions. Some early speculation about her ex went too far. They wrestled with their own biases and their desire to help without causing more harm. But they kept trying to channel their curiosity and their anger into something constructive, not just spirals of rumor. If you've watched a lot of true crime content, you know that online sleuthing can go very wrong. Innocent people are doxxed. Theories spiral out of control. Families are re-traumatized by strangers treating their loved one's death like a puzzle game. That's real, and it's why any story about the internet solving a crime needs to be told with caution. But that doesn't mean online communities can't ever play a positive role. It means the line between engaged citizen and armchair vigilante is one we have to be conscious about walking. In this case, the difference was partly structural. Evidence was handed to detectives, not blasted on Twitter with accusations. Leads were documented, not acted upon physically by random fans. The gamers didn't try to arrest anyone themselves. They tried to make sure people whose job it is to investigate couldn't ignore what they'd found. And even then, it took persistence. They had to call twice. Had to explain over and over what a Discord ID was, why a VOD could matter, how IP logs work. They had to translate the reality of digital life into a language the system understood. So, as we close this story, I want to leave you with a few questions, not answers. If you spend a lot of time online, in games, in fandoms, in comment sections, how do you think about safety? Whose behavior do you brush off because that's just the internet? Where is your line between annoying and alarming? If you create content, or if someone you love does, what structures are in place to support them when a viewer crosses boundaries? Is there a plan, or is everyone improvising as they go? And when you see a case like this covered in headlines about gamers solving a murder, what stories do you tell yourself about people who spend their nights in virtual worlds? Does this change them at all? Because for all the talk about algorithms and virality and hype, the heart of true crime, and of stories like this, is still painfully simple. A real person is gone. The people who loved her, online and offline, are left with a hole that no sentence can fill. And somewhere, in a Discord server that once felt like just another spot on the internet, there's an empty voice channel slot where her name used to be. If you were one of those 5 people in the match that night, listening as a door opened and everything changed, what would you have done? What could you have done? Let me know what you think. Do you believe the jury got it right in focusing on the obsessive fan? Do you think online communities should play a bigger, or smaller, role in investigations like this? And have you ever seen something online that felt off enough that you wondered if you should tell someone offline? Drop your thoughts, your experiences, and if you feel comfortable, your own stories of how online communities have kept you safe or failed to. And wherever you're watching or listening from tonight, whether it's on a second monitor while you queue up just one more match, or on your phone in bed with the lights off, take a second to check in with your own boundaries and your own safety. Behind every username, there's a life as fragile and as real as yours. Take care of yourself, and take care of each other.